The war in Iran might be winding down, maybe, but the damage is already done. Not just the bombs, but the laws that were broken, the rules that held the world together in peace since 1945, the ones written in the blood of World War II. The U.S. may have already violated them. Strikes on a school, hospitals, threats to wipe out a country's water plants, power plants, and bridges, and maybe even an entire civilization. A war that was started without a vote in Congress, without approval from the UN, without legal justification of really any kind. So what does peace even mean when you've already crossed those lines? What does America look like on the world stage the morning after this? That's why today my guest is Yale Law professor Oona Hathaway, who's here to tell us what we've already done and what we can't take back. It's Friday, April 17th, 2026. I'm Grant Hermes, and this is Make It Make Sense. Real quick, warmer weather is just around the corner. Maybe you've got those spring break plans with the family, or maybe you've already got summer on the mind, but either way, you definitely don't want to get caught in last year's sunglasses. Aquila is an independent eyewear brand out of Los Angeles, and they make handcrafted sunglasses that actually look good without the ridiculous designer markup. We're talking plant-based materials, recycled lenses, sustainable packaging. They even donate 1% of all sales to environmental nonprofits, and Make It Make Sense gets a cut too. So you know you look good and you're doing some good too. The frames all look great, they're reasonably priced, and you can get them in UV blockers, blue light blockers, and even prescription lenses. Right now, you can use the code MIMS25 at aquila.la for 10% off your entire order. That is the best discount offer they have, and you're not going to find a better deal anywhere else. Just head to aquila.la, that's IKILA.la, and use the code MIMS25 at checkout. The link for that is in the show notes. All right, let's get on with the show. Oona, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I want to start with, you were one of 100 professors on national security, international security, foreign policy, who said that the United States was breaking the UN Charter, might be committing war crimes in Iran. Are we still breaking the law right now in Iran?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, the answer is yes. So the United Nations Charter requires that for states to use military force, they either have to seek approval from the UN Security Council or be acting in their own self-defense against an armed attack by another state. And of course, neither of those things is true here. So it's a clear violation of the United Nations Charter, and that's what over 100 international lawyers said. It's important to note a violation of the U.S. Constitution, because the U.S. Constitution requires that it's Congress that has to authorize war, not the president acting alone. And president has decided to go to war. We didn't talk about that in the letter because this was an international lawyer's letter, but yeah. I just want to note this is important for Americans to know that the U.S. Constitution is also an issue here. It's Congress that has the power to declare war. It's Congress that has the power to raise and support armies. Yes, the president is a commander in chief, but it's always been understood that the kind of allocation of authority between the president and Congress is that Congress decides to go to war and the president executes. The president is the one who then figures out how to do it. And then you also raised this question of war crimes. So that's more difficult. And the letter did raise this as a concern because we're seeing things like the U.S. strike on a girls' school that killed over 160 civilians, including lots of children, lots of hospitals, other schools, energy facilities, lots of things that normally are clearly off limits in war are being struck. And so then you have to ask the question, like, is this intentional? Were they trying to target these civilian objects, were known as civilian objects in law of armed conflict? No, I don't think the U.S. Army was intentionally targeting the girls' school. I don't think they said, there's a girls' school, let's target it. But the president and Secretary of Defense Hegseth have been saying all kinds of things about, let's get rid of these stupid rules of engagement, which are
Yeah.
the rules within the U.S. Department of Defense, where I worked for a year, that are meant to actually keep U.S. targeting consistent with international law. And so we see all these strikes that are happening that we worry, are we following the rules in the way we're supposed to? Are we just targeting what are called military objectives? That is, simply put, basically things that are contributing to the military effort and where destroying them actually advances the military cause. And are you taking account of the impact that that's going to have on civilians? You have to, even if it's a military objective, if it's going to kill a bunch of civilians or have a major impact on civilian life, you're supposed to not do that. And you're supposed to take precautions to avoid killing civilians. So part of the difficulty as an outsider in assessing this is under international law, you have to kind of know what they knew. And you have to know what information they had, and you have to know what they were intending to do. So it's difficult for us to say with 100% certainty, yes, that was a war crime. But what we can say is there are a lot of strikes on civilian objects that, if they had been intentional, would be illegal. There are a lot of civilians who are being killed, which, if intentional, would be illegal. We have the president and secretary of defense saying all kinds of things that suggest that they don't care about the law. And so putting those things together, it raises real questions as to whether the U.S. is following the law in the way that it's conducting the war. So it raises real concerns for us about whether the United States is abiding by its legal obligations under the Geneva Conventions in 1949 and customary international law as it's evolved since then.
And I can only assume that those concerns only grow because this week we had Pete Hegseth again saying the United States is going to continue to, I guess, develop plans to target bridges and power plants and desalination plants. The president has threatened that multiple times, not to mention threatening what was, I think, generally understood at this point as the use of a nuclear weapon in Iran. I mean, he obviously didn't outright say that, but that's pretty much how that threat was interpreted, of civilization erasure in Iran.
Yeah.
Which also, by my understanding of it and several other international lawyers that I talked to understanding of it, that was potentially a violation of the genocide code in the Geneva Convention as well, which I know is not the actual technical term for what that is, but like the definition of genocide, right? So,
yeah.
So, I mean, at this point, is anything the United States does in Iran that's beyond what we're doing right now, so outside of a ceasefire, does that fall under, or at least come way closer to this war crimes category because of those signals of intent that we're seeing that you were just kind of talking about?
Yeah, I mean, look, even engaging in threats that are meant to terrorize the civilian population is itself a violation of the Geneva Conventions. And one could see President Trump's threat to destroy an entire civilization, never to return, was effectively that kind of a threat meant to terrorize the civilian population. So that may itself be a threat. The Secretary of Defense Hegseth has also threatened to give no quarter, which basically means, you're not going to accept surrender or refrain from harming those who are what we call hors de combat. That's people who are born wounded and therefore no longer in combat. That's illegal. That is itself, just words actually can violate the Geneva Conventions and can be serious violations of the Geneva Conventions. And there's some, you're right, who interpret this threat to destroy an entire civilization as essentially a threat to commit genocide. So, there are those concerns. What I look at, when I step back and look at all of what's happening, I look at the fact that there are a lot of strikes that are happening that are killing civilians and that are destroying what are ordinarily protected objects. We see a president and the Secretary of Defense who are running this war, who are the ones issuing the orders, who are threatening to do things that, if they were carried out, would clearly be illegal and that would be massive war crimes if they actually happened. Destruction of all of the civilian infrastructure, as the president and secretary have both threatened to do, destroying bridges, schools, water desalination plants. These are things that are just clearly out of bounds under the law. and then waging the war illegally in the first place under the UN Charter and under the US Constitution. This is a administration that is waging a war without any regard for the law. And it's clear the lawyers are just being kept out of the conversations, or if they're not, they're very bad lawyers because no lawyer could sign off on what's being said here. And then we look at also the fact that within the Department of Defense, there was a whole office that had been created under the last administration that was devoted to figuring out how to better protect civilians. And what the Secretary of Defense has done is just fired those people, more or less eliminated that office. They can't completely eliminate it because it was created by Congress, but they basically have unstaffed it. They moved people, they fired people.
There's one person that turns the lights on and off every day, and that's kind of it there.
There's very little left of that. So that's an intent to get rid of the infrastructure that was in place to protect civilians. They've been firing JAGs. These are the Judge Advocates General whose job is to make sure that what the U.S. is doing stays within law. So you look at all of that, and we can say, it's hard for us to say this strike or that strike was a war crime because I need to know things I don't have access to. I need to know what they knew about, the object that they were targeting in order to say that with 100% certainty. But what I can say from looking at this broader picture is that there is real reason to think that the U.S. is not conducting this war consistent with the law. And, that triggers a whole host of responsibilities, that is, to investigate these civilian casualty incidents and make sure that they were done consistent with the law. And if they weren't, to prosecute those who are responsible. The Geneva Conventions actually include within them this obligation to investigate and prosecute. And there's no sign that there's any intention to do any of that. So, it's deeply troubling. It suggests a kind of abandonment of this post-war legal structure that was meant to protect people during wartime, protect innocent civilians who didn't choose this war, who, are the ones who are really the victims of the Iranian government. They're the ones who've been harmed by the Iranian government. The president suggested that he was waging this war for their sake, but
right.
But then he's destroying, what they need to build their lives. If you're destroying civilian infrastructure, if you're threatening to destroy water desalination plants, who's going to suffer from that?
Right.
It's going to be ordinary people who are going to be suffering from that. So you can't say on the one hand, you're waging the war on behalf of ordinary Iranians and then deprive them of water, or threaten to even threaten to deprive them of water, destroy their schools, destroy their hospitals, destroy their bridges, destroy their infrastructure, destroy everything that they need to be able to live their lives. And the law is meant to protect them. And this war is being waged in a way that just suggests a complete disregard for that desire. And that's what's so alarming for me. Put talk of war crimes and all that to one side. I mean, do I think that criminal trials are going to happen anytime soon? No. But what I do hope is that raising these concerns, you mentioned the letter that I contributed to, raising these concerns will cause the administration to fight the war in a way that's consistent with our longstanding legal obligations that president after president across multiple parties have been committed to and have abided by for the last 80 years.
I think because there's this sort of twofold question here. And one of the side of that is that, what does this mean for the broader understanding and adherence to international law, this thing that we've agreed to for the last, 80 years post World War II, that has kept civilians safe, that has kept wars that were fought within the bounds of what we would consider to be ethical war, as far as you could call wars ethical in those ways, right? And I think when you mentioned earlier that the rules of engagement that Pete Hegseth derided so much, and I've written quite a bit about that on the Substack, and that Pete Hegseth's certain ways of serving in the military and the way he approached this thing is designed to him kind of like the idea of a war crime or whatever. But those rules and international law is also meant to keep American troops safe and American combatants safe and our personnel safe as well. So what does it mean for the United States to be engaging in wars this way for the overall international legal order? Because I have to imagine that other countries are looking at this and are saying, well, if the United States can just kind of do this, what's to say, we should really care all that much about Russia and Ukraine or China and Taiwan, or something is, really dangerous as India and Pakistan, where you would actually have the real threat of a nuclear strike in that way. Like, I think those escalations are out there.
Yeah. I mean, I think you put your finger on it. Look, we created this international law not just out of the goodness of our hearts. We
Right.
created this international law because it served our best interests. And because, we thought it was the right thing to do, but also because we thought it was good for Americans and for America. U.S. actually wrote the UN Charter. The United Nations Charter was drafted in the U.S. State Department. In my book, The Internationalists, I tell the story about how the UN Charter was first written. It was written beginning in 1942 with a small group of lawyers, U.S. government lawyers, wrote the draft of the UN Charter and then negotiated it with the Soviets and the United Kingdom, came up with the draft that then was delivered essentially to the rest of the world, which then amended it and adjusted it. But basically, the blueprint that the U.S. put together is what created the UN. That's why it's located in the United States. The United States is the champion of this organization. U.S. also was a key player in the negotiations of the Geneva Conventions and the additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions. And they weren't, again, doing this out of the goodness of their heart. They had just fought a major war. Millions had died. U.S. had spent tons of money. U.S. soldiers had died in this war, as well as in World War I. And U.S. soldiers have been taken prisoner of war. Mm-hmm. And, we had a direct interest in, on the one hand, ensuring that wars didn't happen again. And that's the UN Charter's whole purpose, is to keep international peace and security. And that was why we created that regime, because we didn't want to have to go running around the world trying to keep the peace and putting U.S. soldiers at risk in the process. And we also, had allies that we didn't want to have be subject to aggressive wars, as, of course, Nazi Germany. The whole point of that was that Hitler wanted to take over Europe. And, we were there to try and stop him. We're eventually going to come to the aid of our allies. And if we don't, eventually it's going to come to our doorstep. So that we understood that, and that's why we created the charter. And then the Geneva Conventions was as much about protecting American soldiers as it was about protecting people outside the United States. Mm-hmm. And it's about protecting Americans. It's not just about protecting American soldiers when they get taken prisoner. It's about, when you fight a war where you are killing people's children, they hate you. And you will never win them over. You will never actually win the war. Like, generations will hate you. Mm-hmm. And that is why the U.S. military understands that you have to follow certain rules if you're ever going to really win. Like, you might subjugate a people, you might dominate them temporarily, but they're going to come for you eventually. And if you're not fighting fair, if you're not following basic rules that ordinary human beings think are the basic rules that you ought to play by, which, the international law, for all its technicalities, and we can get into the details, and, I know that's not something we want to do here, but we can talk about various articles and we talk about all the technicalities, but really at bottom, what it's about is reflecting a basic human intuition, which is that, innocent people shouldn't be targeted, and that if you can at all possibly protect people and civilian objects during war so that people can rebuild their lives when the war is over, you should do that. Like, that's the basic intuition of the law. And if you don't do those things, then when the war is over, which it will eventually be over, you will never have real peace if you have not followed those rules. And so I think U.S. military understands that. This is why the U.S. military, when I worked in the Pentagon, the people who are the most significant proponents of abiding by our legal obligations were uniformed military officers, because they understood that this is what was necessary to actually succeed in the war effort. It wasn't because they were bleeding hearts. It was because they understood how important it was and is to their mission.
Why doesn't it seem like that is the case now? I mean, there are still serious people there, regardless of the number of people that Pete Hegseth has been firing lately. There are still those folks there. So why doesn't it seem like we're fighting that kind of a war in Iran right now?
Yeah. I mean, look, I don't know exactly what's going on within the Pentagon. I think there's something of a culture war going on within the Pentagon. I think that when the president issued his threat to destroy an entire civilization, and when the Secretary of Defense said we're going to destroy all the civilian infrastructure, I believe that there was resistance, even though a lot of the resistors have been fired and moved, and if you look at it, like, there's been a kind of general cleansing of the military, of like getting rid of anybody who had sort of refused to follow illegal orders. But I think that was a step too far for many. And at least what I've heard is that there was some pushback within CENTCOM, and that part of the reason the president backed off of that threat wasn't entirely clear the military was going to fully execute. And if you look at what the president says and then what the military says about certain kinds of strikes, they're very different. So destruction of a major bridge, and the president's like, oh, we just destroyed that bridge, like, we're going to get them. But then you see the CENTCOM readout, and it's like, here's the military purpose. They actually
Right.
like, here's actually why this is lawful military objective. It was being used for this particular military purpose. And this is why we consider it to be a lawful military objective. So they're trying to show that they're abiding by the rules. Now, how it is that they're internally justifying certain of these strikes, I am not confident about, because I think that if they think that energy infrastructure, generally speaking, is within limits, I think they're clearly wrong about that. And it's clear that energy infrastructure, energy like power plants that are being used to support the Iranian military, those are lawful targets. That's a military objective. Power plant that's supplying a military base, or, oil depot that's being used by the Iranian military. Yes, like, that's within limits. But the whole energy infrastructure, no.
Right.
that's not
Right.
within limits. That's not lawful. And so, I don't know how they're justifying it. I think part of the reason that you haven't seen these strikes of the kind that the president and Secretary of Defense have been threatening is that the military can't come up with a lawful justification for that extensive destruction. So they're making all these threats, but then when it comes to execution, it's much more limited. And I think there's a disconnect between what the leadership is saying and what the military is willing to actually do. How long the military can hold out and how much they're just going to keep firing people until they find people who are going to do everything that they want, I don't know.
Yeah.
Right. So we might get to a point where there's no resistance at all. And that's a very dangerous place to be, because then you've got a U.S. military that's willing to do clearly completely unlawful things.
Right.
And, that's dangerous, because that's a U.S. military will do unlawful things, not just in Iran, but potentially back here at home.
Right. The other side of the international law question and adhering to it that I was thinking about is that it also protects U.S. standing around the world. And I've been wondering for the last 6 weeks or so how much of a pariah the United States is going to become because of this. It's clear that our allies in Europe are they are pulling away from us. I mean, like, yes, I know that the Secretary General of NATO was saying lots of nice things about Donald Trump, but also he's not really, he doesn't have the same political constituency as other leaders in Europe, nor the exact same safety concerns as other political leaders in Europe. But also, like, are we a rogue nation at this point? Are we getting close to that? Because
we're getting close to it.
It feels that way.
Yeah. Look, here's my read of the situation. I think countries are appalled. They're kind of stunned. They don't really know what to make of it. They're just so, I think they're overwhelmed by the magnitude of the shift in the United States, and what they understood to be United States that stood for certain kinds of principles, it stood for a certain vision of the world, is just so at odds with the United States that they're seeing today. And they're in, when I lived in Germany in the fall, and, talking to people there, it was so interesting. It was like they just couldn't reconcile the reality of what the United States is doing with their image of what the United States is. But that's beginning to change. People are starting to say, okay, I guess this is the United States we're dealing with, and we are going to have to come to terms with that. Now, I think the U.S. hasn't seen the full brunt of that yet, because everyone is still structured around a really fundamental reliance on the United States, militarily, economically, politically. They've come to rely on the United States. They structured their political futures on the United States. They structured their economic futures in the United States. And it's very hard to sort of immediately disengage. But what you're seeing is they're starting to invest in a future that doesn't include the United States.
Yeah.
So in Europe, they're building their military. Germany, where I was living in the fall, is going to have the fourth largest army in the world in a few years, at the level that they're investing. Right now, they can't defend themselves against Russia without the United States, but in 4 years, 5 years, they will be able to. And they're going to need us less. Canada, completely economically invested in the United States, built its future, its economic and military future, on like complete partnership with the United States. Now you see Carney traveling the world, creating a whole new set of economic relations and negotiating all the kinds of new economic deals to reduce that dependence on the United States. So look, in 3-4 years, countries are going to be in a place where they no longer depend on us. And then we are really going to see the consequences. We're really, particularly if we don't see a change in presidency, if we see an election of either, I know Donald Trump's threatening to run for an illegal third term. If that were to happen, that would just be the end of it. But even if, somebody in the kind of his vein and his attitude towards the world is elected, I think we're going to see the U.S. become a real outcast, a pariah. But right now, the world can't afford to do that, because they have structured their futures around a United States that they can depend on. And they can't turn that ship immediately. They can't start denouncing the United States because President Trump will throw tariffs on them, or stop selling them arms, or refuse to come to their defense. So it's impossible to pull back. But that won't be true forever. So in a few years, we're going to see the consequences.
At home here, there's been a lot of talk about invoking the 25th Amendment in some way, shape, or form. Is there, do you think, an international security argument to be made in this moment of all the stuff you just said about the United States shrinking from our place in the world, from the security risks that we pose, whether it's a rogue nation status, whether it's a pariah status, that maybe the 25th Amendment needs to be invoked here so that we don't upend the world order, not just because the president isn't fit to do the job of the oath of office that he took for the United States, but for what it means to the rest of the world.
Yeah, I don't hold a lot of confidence that is the way forward here. I don't, because I just don't see Congress following through on its side of that bargain. And I don't see his cabinet turning on him. So I just don't think that's realistic. What I do think is realistic, and I think is the only way forward, is for Congress to actually do its job. So Congress has got to come in and start exercising its authority as a co-equal branch of government. And, it's got to withdraw funding from the president for this illegal war. It's got to insist on its constitutional role. And right now, it's just completely his lapdog and is doing nothing. Now, the midterm elections obviously will shift that, but I don't want to put all my hope in the midterm elections, because that's pretty risky. I think the Republicans in Congress right now ought to be doing more to push back on the president and to insist that they have a say too. And I think that's our only hope for the next 3 years, to be honest. I think, unfortunately, I feel like we learned the lesson with the impeachment fight. And, I think the 25th Amendment is unfortunately going to face the exact same fate. And I would hate for us to put all our energy into that when we actually have a way that we could tame the president, which is to insist that Congress is the one who decides whether we go to war. It's Congress that controls appropriations. Congress has the capacity to rein in this president if it chooses to do it.
Yeah. Well, Oona, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
I want to thank Oona again for coming on the show. You can find links to her work at Yale Law School and as editor of Just Security, one of the clearest voices right now on what the law actually demands of us, even and when, especially when it's inconvenient. Those are in the show notes. And if this conversation made you think, share it, put it in the group chat, send it to someone who needs to hear this stuff right now. That's how this show grows, and that's how these conversations reach people who can actually do something about it. Or if you just want to talk about it, that's great too. You can subscribe to the Make It Make Sense Substack for this weekend's Make It Make Nonsense essay. Follow the show at MIMS Newspod. That's MIMS Newspod on every platform. That is all one word. You can find me at Grant Hermes on Twitter and Blue Sky, and Grant_Hermes on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Grant Hermes, and I'll talk to you next time.